Moss Gown by William H. Hooks, illustrated by Donald Carrick. Long ago, in the Old South, there was a man who owned a great plantation. He lived with his 3 daughters in a snow-white house, pillared with 8 marble columns on every side. The man grew old and sickly. His limbs shook and his eyesight dimmed. He no longer delighted in riding through his fine fields or hunting in the mysterious swamp. He spent his days sitting on the wide porch, pondering what to do with his lands. At last, one pale gray day, when a skittering wind splashed rain against the tall columns, the old man called to his daughters, "Retha, Grenadine, and Candace, where's my little Candace?" Retha and Grenadine, the older daughters, peered out through the windows and laughed at their father. "Look at the old fool," said Retha. "He's getting all wet," said Grenadine. Candace, the youngest daughter, rushed out onto the porch. "Come inside, father," she said. "You're shaking in this foul wind that blows so damp and cold." "Summon your sisters," said the old man. "I've a gift for each of you." Hearing the word gift, the older sisters rushed outside. Grenadine cried, "Father, poor father, you're cold from the wind." "Shame on you, Candace," scolded Retha, "letting our father get wet in the rain." "Please listen, my daughters," said the old man. "I have pondered long how to divide my lands, and today the answer came." Grenadine and Retha winked at each other and snickered behind his back. Candace stared lovingly at her father. "I have a question, my daughters. How much do you love me? Answer that question and think carefully what you say, for I will divide my lands among you according to the degree of your love." Retha and Grenadine hugged the old man and smothered him in fancy phrases. "We love you," they cried, "more than diamonds and rubies, more than bright silver and fine gold." The man smiled at his older daughters, but in his secret heart he loved most dearly young Candace. He waited for her words, hoping they would be the best. Candace knew her sisters flattered the old man only to gain a larger gift. She remained quiet, searching her heart for some simple, truthful way to say how much she loved her father. At last she found the right words. She took her father's hand and said, "Father, I love you more than meat loves salt." "What does that mean?" said Grenadine. "I always knew it," shouted Retha. "She loves our father no more than common salt." Angry and hurt, the old man pulled his hand away from Candace. "Is that your answer?" he asked. Candace struggled for words to explain, but no words came. The air was filled with her sister's shrieks. "Ungrateful!" yelled Retha. "What a shameful thing to say to our dear father!" cried Grenadine. Candace held back her tears. It broke her heart to think that her father liked the fancy, false words of her sister more than the simple, true words that came from her heart. The old man trembled with disappointment, believing that the daughter he had loved most loved him as little as common salt. He struggled to his feet and said sternly, "I must keep my word. Candace will always have my love, but all my lands I give to Retha and Grenadine." The sky darkened, and the wind rattled the windows. By nightfall, a hurricane lashed the tall columns of the great white house. Even as the old man slept with troubled dreams of Candace, Retha and Grenadine turned their sister out into the stormy night. "Leave this land," they shouted. "It belongs to us now." The cruel wind pulled at Candace and harshly pushed her about, but she felt strangely unafraid as the wind drew her closer and closer to the murky gray-green swamp. A mighty blast, howling like a hurt animal, lifted her up and sent her flying over the black-green cypress treetops. She rode the wind lightly, letting it toss her to and fro like a floppy rag doll. Then the wind dropped her down. down through wet branches, past tall rushes and tangled vines, and set her softly on a bed of gray Spanish moss, deep in the heart of the swamp. With the last of her strength, Candace burrowed into the bed of moss and fell into a deep sleep. The sound of singing awakened her. Gris, 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 grind. Who'll wear my magic gown? Gris, 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 grind. Who'll wear my gown so fine? Candace peeked through the moss, her heart pounding with fear at what she might see. A slender, green-eyed witch woman, black and sleek as a velvet cat, sat at the foot of her moss bed. In her hand she held a gossamer gown that glistened in the moonlight. The black woman sang, Gris, gris, woman, work all night, weave a gown so fine, stitch in stars and pale moonlight, gris, 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 grind. The slender black gris woman turned her green cat's eyes towards Candace. Calm your heart, she said, and put on this gown so fine. It holds magic as long as the morning star does shine. Candace could only stare with wonder at the shimmering gown. Suddenly, a cloud passed over the moon. A swamp bird shrieked. Candace hid again, deep in the moss bed, and lay trembling. She heard whispered words, Moss gown, if you ever need me, say the chant, gris, 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 grind, and I'll be with you as sudden as the flash of a firefly. Then all was quiet again. The cloud passed and the moon shone. Candace sat up. The beautiful black witch woman was gone, but the gossamer gown lay on a log, sparkling in the moonlight. Quickly, Candace put on the gown and started to walk. Her feet seemed to know the way. They were fleet and sure, pulled by a force she could not control. But as the morning star faded and the red sun rose, Candace saw her beautiful gown turn into rags and gray moss. She reached the end of the swamp and saw a house as fine and grand as the white-pillared mansion of her father. She knocked at the door. When the mistress of the house saw the girl dressed in rags and moss, she took pity on her and sent her to the kitchen to help with the chores. 3. Who are you? Asked first cook. Candace hesitated, not wanting to tell them her name. Well, bellowed first cook, can't you speak? To her surprise, Candace answered, Moscow. A fancy name won't help you here, answered first cook with a scowl. The kitchen help gave Moscow all the hardest chores. They lent her old clothes to wear, and she hid the drab moss dress under her bed. Moscow never smiled or sang or joked with the kitchen help. She dreamed of returning home. How she wished she might have another chance to tell her father how much she loved him. She yearned to explain what she had meant when she said, I love you more than meat loves salt. But as fall turned to winter, Moscow gave up her dreams of returning to a home where no one wanted her. Then came spring, all warm and flowery. There was great excitement in the kitchen. The young master of the house is holding a frolic, announced first cook. A 3-day frolic with picnics and balls. First cook clapped her hands. We're all invited to the ball, she announced. Everyone? Asked Moscow. Everyone who has a ball gown, replied first cook. The first night of the frolic, all the household went to the ball. Everyone, that is, except Moscow, who had no dress to wear. Alone in her small room, Moscow tried to sleep, but the music from the ball teased her ears. She thought of the wonderful balls that they had held at her father's great house. Suddenly, she remembered the witch woman's words. She pulled the tattered gown from under the bed, held it in her hands, and chanted, Gris, 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 grind. Sparkling lights like fireflies, all aglow, filled the dark room. Moscow blinked her eyes and saw the gris woman. Her hand was touching the gown, and it shimmered and glowed. She helped Moscow into the dress. Remember, this gown holds magic only as long as the morning star shines, said the gris woman. Now off you go to the ball. Moscow thanked the gris woman and hurried to the ball. When she arrived, the dancers gasped. "Who is this beautiful stranger?" The handsome young master of the house came to her with outstretched hand and swirled her away in a dance. "Who are you? Where do you come from?" he asked. Moscow laughed and teased, but never told him her name or where she came from. When the night was danced away and the morning star began to fade, the young master said, "Let me take you home, so I may learn where you live." But Moscow slipped away when the young master turned to talk to the musicians. She ran to her room and quickly closed the door, just as the shimmering gown changed to moss and rags. The next day, First Cook said, "What a sight you missed, Moscow! What a beautiful lady, and nobody knows who she is. Pity you can't come tonight and see for yourself." That night, after the others left for the ball, Moscow took out the poor dress. "Gris, gris, 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 grind," she whispered. Before her eyes flashed the Gris Gris woman, and once more she changed the moss and rags into a glittering gown. Again, Moscow ran to the ball and danced through the night with the young master. And again, as the morning star began to pale, she slipped away. The last night of the frolic, Moscow hated to have it end. She danced on and on with the young master until the morning star faded and the gown began turning to rags. In panic, she cried to the young master, "Look, over there, by the window." When he turned away, she fled from the ball. The young master said, "I see only the red sun rising in the window." But Moscow was gone. "Where is my beautiful lady?" he asked. "Did anyone see her leave?" None of the dancers had seen Moscow go, but an old woman sitting by the door said, "No one left the ball, no one at all, except a poor serving girl dressed all in rags." The guests drifted away. The young master went off to search the countryside for the beautiful stranger. Many weeks passed. At last, the young master decided to come home, thinking he would never find the girl. Through the kitchen window, Moscow watched the young master's return. It broke her heart to see how sad and discouraged he looked. Moscow longed to tell him who she was, but she feared he would love only the girl in the shimmering dress, not poor Moscow, who helped in the kitchen. Day after day, the young master brooded. First Cook said, "Young master is wasting away. We must get him to eat something." Moscow spoke. "Let me take supper to him tonight." First Cook laughed and said, "You may try, but I doubt if you'll succeed." At nightfall, Moscow hurried to her room. She put on the ragged dress. "Gris, gris, 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 grind," she whispered. Instantly, the Gris Gris woman was there. "This time," she said, "when the morning star fades, do not run away." She touched the ragged dress, and it glowed with magic light. Moscow found young master still sitting on the porch. She tapped him lightly. "I've brought your supper," she said. "Go away," said the young master, in a sad, low voice. "Please, just take a look at what First Cook has sent," pleaded Moscow. The young master turned toward her. "I'm dreaming," he said. "It's you! Are you real?" "Hush, hush," said Moscow. "Eat your supper, and I'll answer your questions." Moscow and the young master talked on and on through the night. Neither of them noticed when the morning star paled and the first glimmer of the rising sun spread over them. The magic gown began to turn to rags and moss. Suddenly, Moscow's hand brushed against the rags. She trembled, afraid that the young master would no longer love the girl in the tattered dress. But she dared ask, "How much do you love me now?" "More than ever," declared the young master. "Rags and tatters could never hide your beauty." 4. Moscow and the young master were married the very next week. Friends and relatives from all over gathered to celebrate. At the back of the hall, 2 strangers appeared. A slender black woman with cat-green eyes and an old man, feeble and almost blind. After the wedding feast, no one could find the woman with the cat-green eyes, but the old man lingered, seeming confused and lost. The servants took him in to warm by the kitchen fire. The old man had been wandering for many weeks, and he told them a tale of 2 cruel daughters who had squandered his wealth. Alas, the daughters had turned him out to sleep in the fields and beg for his food. The next day, Moscow saw the old man sitting in the kitchen garden, and she knew that he was her father. She rushed to his side and said, "Good sir, do you know who I am?" The old man squinted his eyes and stared at her, but he did not recognize his daughter. "I hope you are a kind lady who will spare an old man a little bread and meat from your table." Moscow was grieved that her father did not recognize her. "You are welcome in my house, good sir," she replied. She hurried to the kitchen. "First cook," she called, "make a special dinner tonight and leave the salt out of everything." First cook was puzzled, but she prepared the meal. Moscow had her father seated next to her at the long dinner table. When he tasted the food, he frowned and pushed his plate away. Moscow handed him a salt cellar. "Here," she said softly, and then she added, "I love you more than meat loves salt." The old man looked up. His eyes seemed to clear for a moment, and he recognized his daughter. "My long-lost Candace," he cried, reaching for her hand. "How I misjudged you! How I have missed you!" "Those are the words I have longed to hear," said Candace, and she hugged her father. The young master invited the old man to stay with them as long as he liked. There was rejoicing and dancing in the great house that night. "Candace is a pretty name," said the young master to his bride as they danced, "but Moscow will always be my name for you." Then he whispered in Candace's ear, "I love you, Moscow, more than meat loves salt."